And this is part 2 of this section of what is so far 8 parts. This is the 8th part of my series on Paul, the false apostle. This is part 2 of this section of it, which is titled what is it titled? What did I call it? Oh, the resurrection body in Paul. So in the last one, we covered Paul more directly from James D. Tabor's book, Paul and Jesus. This is a follow-up to that, where he's going to go, the author's going to go into a number of, well, he's going to go into all of the gospel accounts of the burial and resurrection. And he's going to draw out a lot of the discrepancies, inconsistencies in the accounts, contradictions in the accounts. It's very popular for traditional Christians, I say traditional Pauline Christians, I should say, in the churches to preach against these quote-unquote so-called discrepancies. And they sort of pick out the ones that are more or less easier to explain away. But they really don't know what to do with these more explicit discrepancies. And what I'm going to be doing, and so what these discrepancies he brings out are intended to show in his 3rd chapter here, is that they're actually lending more support, buttressing the conclusion he drew from the previous chapter regarding the nature of Paul's resurrection body as being a new body, a replacement, an embodied resurrection, but not the reconstitution of the physical body. So before I start, there's going to be more reading rather than explaining like in the last video, because there's a lot of material here. So trying to summarize it all would be a little difficult. But before I begin the section, I'm going to go to the very end of it to summarize, where he summarizes the nature of certain problems. He summarizes at the end here the issues that he covered in more detail at the beginning, which I'll go back and read. But I think you should have the summary so you can see that these discrepancies are not discrepancies only in appearance. They are very substantial, and they have not been adequately dealt with. They've not been adequately answered by Pauline Christians. So he, let's see, where is it that he does this? He summarizes this here. Yes, some have argued that these differences in our gospel accounts are the expected result of reports from, oh wait, hold on, let me start a little bit earlier. These dichotomies are quite striking. Where? Galilee or Jerusalem? So the texts, Matthew through John, are inconsistent in terms of where Jesus first appeared after his resurrection. A couple of these accounts, Matthew and Mark, say Galilee. Luke and John say Jerusalem. When? Immediately on the day the tomb was discovered, or weeks thereafter? So in these same texts, the texts that claim that Jesus first appeared to them in Jerusalem are the texts that claim he appeared to them immediately. Those texts which say he did not appear to them until he did so in Galilee are saying that he appeared later. And then he says, and what? Visionary-like experiences or resuscitation of a physical corpse? So those texts which might suggest a resuscitation of a physical corpse are those which have Jesus appearing immediately in Jerusalem, whereas those which detail a visionary experience later are describing what happened later in Galilee when Jesus supposedly appeared to them for the first time, right? The internal evidence is decidedly in favor of the Mark-Matthew tradition, which is the Galilee tradition. To even imagine that the kinds of stories that Luke and John relate, set in Jerusalem, were circulating when Paul wrote his gospel is highly improbable. I'm going to skip ahead where he says, some have argued that these differences in our gospel accounts are the expected result of reports from a variety of witnesses, but all testify to the same essential fact. Jesus was raised from the dead. Sometimes the analogy of an automobile accident is suggested. When eyewitnesses report what they saw, each reflects a particular perspective, and there are always differences in details, but the essential facts related to the accident are usually the same. Such an analogy fails in the case of the Gospels. First, there are no eyewitness accounts at all. Second, the reports we have don't even agree on where the sightings of Jesus took place, Galilee or Jerusalem. What we have is a series of theologically motivated traditions written decades after the event, removed from both place and time, battling out competing stories of what happened after Jesus died. They cannot be harmonized. So now we're going to go back to the section I wanted to start with. And this subtitled section is called A Rushed Burial in an Empty Tomb, where he's going to argue that from all appearances, based on material that we can glean from the gospel accounts themselves, the place where Jesus was originally placed, where his body was originally placed, was not intended to be the permanent location of his body. He was actually going to be moved. It was a temporary place from which he was going to subsequently have his body prepared for permanent burial. So he says, I'm going to come down and start right here. This rush to bury provides us with our first insight into why Jesus' tomb was found empty. So, Mark tells us that Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Sanhedrin, the governing council of the Jews, obtained permission directly from the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to remove Jesus' body from the cross and take charge of his burial. You can see that in Mark 15. Apparently, Joseph had sympathies toward Jesus and his followers, since he shows up suddenly in Mark's story and voluntarily exercises his influence to facilitate Jesus' burial. Given the impending festival that began at sunset, there was no time for full and proper Jewish rites of burial that would involve washing the body and anointing it with oil and spices. The women of Jesus' family, who had followed him from Galilee, had plans to carry out these duties, but had to defer them until after the Passover and the Sabbath. See Mark 16, verse 1. So there is no indication that they were in communication with Joseph of Arimathea at the time he took Jesus' body, or through the Passover holiday. The followers of Jesus had mostly fled in fear and were in hiding. See John 20, verse 19. One gets the idea that the women watched from a distance, surely a bit frightened themselves, but wanting to know where the body was taken. The burial was in the hands of Joseph, but they hoped he would allow them, as Jewish custom prescribed, to carry out the traditional rites of burial and mourning. So then he skips down and he quotes John 19, 41 to 42. Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb where no one had ever been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, as the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Okay? People assumed that the tomb into which Joseph of Arimathea placed the body of Jesus belonged to him, that is, Joseph of Arimathea. But here we see that such was not the case. It was a newly hewn tomb with no one buried inside that just happened to be close by. Jesus' body was laid inside, but only temporarily. He was not really buried there, since full and formal burial involved the preparation rites and mourning rituals carried out by the family over a 7-day period. Mark 16:1 and John 20:1. That is why the women showed up early Sunday morning at the tomb, expecting to initiate the burial process with Joseph's cooperation. Okay? Let's see, where do we want to go from here? What Mark knows is that very early Sunday morning, just as the sun was rising, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, and Salome, most likely Jesus' sister, came to the tomb with the intent of washing the body and anointing it with oil and spices. When they arrived, the large blocking stone had already been removed, but the tomb was empty, the body gone. This was precisely what one might expect given the circumstances of Joseph's intentions and activities. But it was a total surprise to the women. They arrived fully expecting to be involved in the rites of proper and final burying. That is why they arrived so early, so as not to miss Joseph, who they expected would return at first light Sunday morning. Mark says that when the women looked into the empty tomb, they saw a young man sitting inside who told them, "Do not be amazed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him as he told you." Mark 16, 6-7. Here, the line between history and theology is clearly drawn. That the tomb was empty fits what we know of the circumstances of Jesus' temporary, quote-unquote, burial by Joseph of Arimathea, but that the women were told that Jesus would meet his disciples in Galilee is clearly a theological embellishment. It is Mark's attempt to connect the empty tomb with subsequent appearances of Jesus. The link is quite weak, since Mark knows of no specifics of any appearances of the risen Jesus to the disciples in Galilee. Otherwise, he surely would have related them to round out the ending to his gospel. I think we have to assume that Mark tells us all he knows, but what Mark knows he gets from Paul. Mark is following Paul here, since it is Paul who reports that Jesus first appears to Peter and his disciples, and in Mark's account, the young man sitting in the tomb specifies Peter by name. See 1 Corinthians 15:5. Mark relates next that the women fled the tomb in fear and amazement, and that they said nothing to anyone. Mark 16:8. The oldest, most authentic copies of Mark end abruptly here at verse 8. The additions found in most translations of the Bible where Jesus appears to various people mentioned in Matthew, Luke, and John were interpolations added to later manuscripts of Mark by editors who could not imagine a gospel ending without appearances of Jesus. Mark also knows an old tradition, not mentioned specifically by Paul, that the first time Peter and the disciples saw Jesus was in Galilee in the north, not in Jerusalem the week of Passover. This is not a minor difference from Luke and John, as we will see. It is a blatant counter story. If we put Mark and Paul together, we get the earliest and most reliable tradition. Faith in Jesus' resurrection began in Galilee with Peter and the apostles as the first to claim they had seen him. Matthew and Luke, using Mark as their source, follow closely his account of the women finding Jesus' tomb empty, though Matthew adds all sorts of supernatural elements, as noted previously. Both flatly contradict Mark's statement that the women said nothing to anyone. In Matthew and Luke, they run to tell the disciples. Matthew 28:8 and Luke 24:9. All seem to agree, however, that the discovery of the empty tomb by the women that Sunday morning did not inspire anyone to believe that Jesus had been raised from the dead. The assumption of everyone was that someone had removed the body. That's an incredibly crucial point. The Gospel of John offers an alternative empty tomb story that is not based on Mark. And although John is our latest gospel, this particular story seems to offer us a less theological account of the story, leading some historians to conclude it might represent a much earlier independent tradition. So he quotes John 20:1-10. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read the part that he emphasizes, where Mary Magdalene runs to the tomb. And then she went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and she said this: "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Think about the implications of that. She assumes that his body has been removed by someone, multiple people. So Peter went out with the other disciples, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciples outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Okay, they saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. Peter went into the tomb. He saw the clothes lying there in the face cloth, which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up into place by itself, etc. So John gives other stories following his account of the empty tomb in which Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and to the disciples as a group, including Thomas, the famous doubter. But this account of the empty tomb stands out. There is no young man or angelic interpreter in the tomb to proclaim the resurrection. Okay? That's another huge discrepancy. Instead, Mary is quite sure the body has been taken elsewhere for burial. Quote, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." John 20:2. One has to ask, who is the they Mary Magdalene has in mind? Based on the hasty burial of Jesus' body in this temporary tomb, it seems obvious that she is referring to Joseph of Arimathea and his assistants. After all, just a few verses earlier, it is John who tells us that the tomb was a temporary one. Peter and the other disciples race to the tomb to verify that it was empty. What they quote unquote believe is not that Jesus has been raised from the dead, as John clarifies, but that the body of Jesus has been removed and reburied, presumably the night before. This fits precisely what we have reconstructed above based on all our sources. You say that the body of Jesus was removed from its temporary resting place to a permanent tomb. This is not at all I'm sorry, he was quoting an academic he wrote to him. I don't need to. Well, here, I'll read that. It's an interesting section. An academic, fellow academic, wrote to the author and saying, you say that the body of Jesus was removed from its temporary resting place to a permanent tomb. This is not at all impossible. Extreme improbability sets in only when you invite us to assume that this group, who knew perfectly well what had actually happened to the body of Jesus, permitted their co-religionists to proclaim not that he was still alive, immortality of the soul, well attested in Judaism, but that he was risen from the dead. This, of course, is against the background of what quote-unquote resurrection meant for first century Jews. In order for me to take your quote-unquote evidence seriously, you would have to explain why the family and or disciples based their future lives on what they knew to be a falsehood, namely that the body had been raised, and finally to justify how the secret was preserved in one of the gabbiest societies in ancient history, end quote. In my judgment, there are several incorrect assumptions embedded in this objection. I showed in the previous chapter that according to Paul, the resurrection of Jesus and resurrection more generally was understood as the re-embodiment of one who has died, not the resuscitation of a corpse. The Gospels, written decades after Jesus' death, began to connect the empty tomb and the disappearance of Jesus' body to subsequent and immediate appearances of Jesus to his followers, even the same day in Jerusalem, proving that he had been raised from the dead. But as we will see, these are late expansions of earlier tradition. What Mark only implies, you will see him in Galilee, is lavishly embellished by Luke and John, but is now set in Jerusalem on the Sunday after the crucifixion. Jesus walks around, wounds and all, eating meals and claiming he is still flesh and bones, directly contradicting Paul's emphatic assertion that Jesus has become a life-giving spirit. Embodied, yes, but not physical or material. Remember, because Paul also says flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. It is a mistake to allow these later texts to frame our objections and take priority over earlier materials. Whether the family and followers of Jesus knew immediately where Jesus had been reburied or learned of the location later, they were not running around Jerusalem in that first week following Jesus' death, proclaiming he had been raised. In fact, a critical reading of our sources will show that there were no sightings of Jesus in Jerusalem at all, but only in Galilee, other than perhaps the single experience of Mary Magdalene in John 20, 11 through 18. And see also Matthew 28, 9 through 10. The matter of a first appearance to Mary Magdalene is always possible, but she is not included in the list of first witnesses that Paul relates. Perhaps since appealing to the testimony of a woman was considered less than convincing. So this video is all the way up to 18 minutes and 20 seconds and counting. So I'm not going to be able to get through the rest of it. We'll see if there's anything important enough in the rest of this section to go over in one more video. If not, I think we can go ahead and just move on to chapter 4. There's some really juicy stuff in 4, and actually I went on. I initially stated at the beginning of this series that I would probably only be covering material up through the 3rd chapter or so. However, I had continued reading on in the book and ended up finishing the book, and I think that it became plain that there's some very important material here. Chapter 4 has some extremely important material that exposes Paul for the hubristic pseudo-apostle that he was. Chapter 5, I think, has maybe some material we could go over. 6, definitely. We need to cover 6 to see how Paul's unique theology of baptism in the Eucharist stood out relative to what would have been taught by Jesus and his 12 disciples. I don't know that we're going to be covering anything in chapter 7. I think we're going to skip chapter 7, but chapter 8 also has a very important, takes a very important look at the difference between Paul's view of the law and the view of the law, the Torah, that Jesus and the rest of the apostles had. Then I'll be adding, to finish out the series, I'm going to be going over, doing a more detailed look at Acts 21 through 26, where Paul is brought to trial. First the Christians. I think they were Jewish Christians, but they were from Asia and they happened to be in Jerusalem. Brought charges against Paul to James and his elders when Paul arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "We heard Paul's preaching and teaching when he was back in Asia, in his territory, in Gentile territory, and he was preaching against the law." Of course, now that Paul is brought before James and the elders, he changes tune. He changes his tune, and he claims that no, I uphold everything in the law, right? So depending on time and place, Paul's message is quite different. And we're going to see that. It's going to show up very clearly in chapters 21 through 26. He's then brought before the Jewish authorities after that. And then after that, he's brought before the Roman authorities on the same charges. So it's this long, drawn-out affair that Paul has to cope with. And we're going to show, too, how Paul's teaching to the Corinthians regarding meat sacrificed to idols is a total contradiction of what came out of the council in Jerusalem in Acts 15 that James headed up. Because as you'll note, in the conclusion to that council, they laid upon the Gentiles only a few principles. They were not requiring the Gentiles to embrace the Torah the way Jews were expected to follow it. And so they laid upon them only a few major principles. One was to abstain from fornication. Another was a flat prohibition on eating meat strangled or sacrificed to idols, right? Whereas in his letter to the Corinthians, Paul says it's no big deal if you eat meat sacrificed to idols, as long as you're able to do so with a clear conscience. The only time you should avoid eating meat sacrificed to idols is if you are in the presence of a brother with a weaker conscience. Completely different message than what we see in Acts 15. So there is clearly a rivalry going on between Peter and the community under James in Jerusalem. We'll be covering some other issues related to Paul, but thank you for listening again and have a great day, guys.